I am honored to be speaking today with Dr. Leonardo Trasande, who is one of my personal heroes. He is the author of the book Sicker, Fatter, Poorer. He is the Jim Hendrick, MD professor, director of the Division of Environmental Pediatrics, and vice chair of research in the Department of Pediatrics at the NYU School of Medicine. He also serves on the faculty of the NYU Wagner School of Public Service and the NYU College of Global Public Health. He is an internationally renowned leader in environmental health, and his research, which we will be talking about today, focuses on the impacts of chemicals on hormones in our bodies. He's led the way in documenting the economic costs for policymakers of failing to prevent diseases of environmental origin proactively. And that sums it up. I know that is quite a lot to take in, but it is exactly what we are dealing with today amidst a pandemic, amidst COVID-19, I should say. And so we're going to talk about where all of the intersections of our health, public health, environmental pollutants, and this particular moment in time, this pandemic intersect. And we get to hear Dr. Trasande's thoughts on all of that and share his thinking and his research with us. So welcome.
It's so great to be here, Amy. Thanks again.
Thank you. Okay, so let's kick off. I want to talk about so much of what you cover in Sicker, Fatter, Poorer, your book. How does the urgent threat of endocrine disrupting chemicals kind of bring this all together? Like, if you can explain to me why these things, and explain to all of our viewers today why these things are related.
Well, you brought us here talking about COVID-19, and the reality of COVID-19 is that it's not the only viral infectious threat that has come on the scene of late. And it's no secret that these kinds of threats are a byproduct of changes in our global environment, where we've put humans in closer contact with newer pathogens in the human environment. Some of that is climate change, some of that is deforestation, and some of that are the synthetic chemicals that are contaminating our planet. It's also known that chemical exposures in the environment have made COVID-19 worse in a variety of ways. There are studies that have documented that air pollution has made us more likely, in some cases, the higher the exposure is in the long term, the more likely you are, unfortunately, to die from COVID-19. That's because air pollution contributes to obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, three of the major risk factors that predict mortality from COVID-19. And now we know that chemicals can also mess with our immune system. We used to think immune defects were byproducts of medical conditions, genetics and such, but we realize that chemical factors are also an important environment. And I know we'll get into the endocrine system later, but the more we think about threats like these in our daily lives that come from the planet, the more we realize that we're not immune to the effects of the broader environment, and that we need to respond to the challenges we face.
Yeah, and thank you, because I think that really ties it into sustainability, right? It's not just one of these things, not just one of these things that we are doing and impacting our environment with are unsustainable. It's actually all of them. And it's all of them coming together in the way that they do. Just so that people have a basic understanding, we are going to be diving into some of the science, and I wanted you to articulate, for the average person, what is this thing we're talking about, endocrine disruption? What's the, an endocrine disruptor and all of that?
So let's break it down in pieces. So endocrine refers to the hormones in our body, and we're used to thinking of hormones as salt, sugar, and sex, but they practically underlie any kind of molecular system and maintain all sorts of bodily functions: temperature, metabolism, and at a basic level, we're talking about signaling molecules. We're talking about traffic signals. I'm near a busy intersection here in New York City that you might be hearing in the background. And the reality is that traffic signals are what these molecules are doing. And these are natural molecules. What we're talking about when we're talking about endocrine disrupting chemicals, these are synthetic chemicals that scramble the molecular signals. They were not designed with hormones in mind. And by scrambling these natural molecular signals, they contribute to all sorts of disease and disability across the lifespan.
So when you talk about scrambling signals and contributing to disease across our lifespan, can you give us some understanding of, what? I mean, you talked about some of what the hormones control, but how does that play out when you see disease?
So we know of about 1,000 synthetic chemicals in the environment that can scramble these molecular signals and contribute to disease and disability. We know the most about 5 categories in particular. So we're talking about pesticides used in agriculture. We're talking about flame retardants in electronics and furniture. We're talking about phthalates used in personal care products, cosmetics, and food packaging. We're talking about bisphenols used in thermal paper receipts and aluminum can linings. And we're talking about perfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, made most famous by Mark Ruffalo's movie Dark Waters, which are used in nonstick cooking and oil and water resistant clothing. So what do? They can have impacts across a host of organ systems. The organ that we know is most vulnerable is the developing brain, particularly in young children. Thyroid hormone isn't just something that maintains a good body temperature and metabolism. It's the major growth factor in a child's brain as they're growing up in utero. And if you even disrupt thyroid hormone within the clinically normal range, you can induce cognitive deficits, autism, and even attention deficit disorder.
Which seems like an awful lot. You also talk in your book and through the research about obesity, and I guess that's linked to diabetes, premature hormones, so premature puberty, early onset puberty, and things like that. So these are not, they may happen early on in development, or they may happen later. Can you speak to some of that, how we're seeing these diseases play out?
That's right. As a pediatrician, I'm biased towards talking about effects on kids and moms. But the reality is life is a vulnerability to endocrine disrupting chemicals. It's just that the time you get exposed and have this damage occurs means that the types of effects you have vary based on when you're getting the exposure in the first place. In particular, as you said, the evidence is especially accelerated over the past 5 years about chemicals literally making us fatter. There are 50 or so chemical obesogens that are known out there. The prototype is a chemical called bisphenol A, or BPA, which has gotten a lot of attention in the news because of baby bottles and sippy cups, as well as aluminum cans. It makes fat cells bigger, disrupts the function of a protein that called adiponectin that protects against heart disease, and it's a synthetic estrogen, so it can have sex-specific effects on body mass as well.
And when I sit here and listen to that, or when I'm reading about that, one of the things that comes to mind is, why would anyone, how did we get here? Why would anyone or any company knowingly use these? Like, why are they in the public sphere?
So some of us probably remember the 1967 movie, The Graduate, where literally Dustin Hoffman is a character played by Dustin Hoffman is told that plastics is the future. And things like plastics were part of the better living through chemistry movement, where we thought that chemistry would make us great as a society. And there's a lot of things that plastics and other chemicals in our life have done to make us feel better. I mean, I'm across the way from the Children's Hospital here, and we have plastic in medical devices. We have a host of other materials that we use that require chemicals to work. The problem is that we assumed, and this was an old assumption based in science, ironically enough, that only the dose made a thing a poison. It's akin to the notion of everything in moderation. So as a medical student going through in the 1990s, that's how I was taught. And toxicology was about really large doses and only the dose making a thing a poison. Unfortunately, we now know that little things matter. And it's these low-level effects of chemicals, particularly on hormones, that have changed our scientific paradigm for thinking about these exposures. And that's alarming. And it doesn't mean we have to go back to the 1800s, but it means we need to rebalance our overall relationship with the planet and the sustainability of that relationship with our planet.
Well, and I think that's what makes your work so interesting is you're thinking about, first of all, you're seeing this in your practice. You're seeing this in, up close and personally with the people who come into your office. But you also have a unique view with the public health sort of hat on, where you think about how do you communicate to people the importance of this, not when they're experiencing it, but so that they are motivated to get ahead of the problem. So we can think about a way to harness our technology, to use it, and create a more sustainable, more just, healthier world to bring that about. So I wanted you to dive into that cost, because this is actually very new work. This hasn't existed for a long time. You've been part of a group really leading this. And so will you talk about the gargantuan number that you guys have come up with to classify what society's burden is based on what we're living with now?
So in 2015, we put together the best of the best scientists in the world to look at the effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals on human health. We told those experts to focus only on the effects for which the science was strongest. And so we focused on 15 exposure outcome relationships. We figured out how much disease was being contributed, what the strength of the science was from the laboratory as well as from human studies. And we even discounted the costs further based on the degree of uncertainty. So if there was weak evidence, we brought those cost estimates down even further. And what we found in the United States alone is that endocrine disrupting chemicals cost society $340 billion. That's billion with a B each year. That's 2.3% of our gross domestic product. And that was based on fewer than 5% of all EDCs, a subset of diseases due to the few EDCs we studied, and a subset of costs due to the few diseases due to the few chemicals we focused on. So this 2% of GDP that we're losing each year is an underestimate of an underestimate of an underestimate. And I just want to say one thing for a minute about the origins of these costs. A lot of it is because kids are less well able to contribute to society and our economy. We like to say that if a child loses one IQ point, maybe mom doesn't notice, teacher doesn't notice, but if 100,000 kids lose an IQ point, the entire economy notices. Each IQ point is worth roughly $20,000, and 4 million kids are born in the US each year. That's a lot of zeros on the right side. But again, this is affecting all of us. Phthalates, for example, disrupt the male sex hormone, testosterone, and low T is either a marker for or predictor of adult cardiovascular disease and stroke. It's not just something for impotence or sperm count. We found that 10,000 US men between the ages of 55 and 64 die each year, losing us $9 billion in economic productivity from them alone. So this is affecting all of us. It's not just affecting moms and babies as well.
I think that's so important because it's really easy for people to relegate this in terms of like, oh, just, pregnant women have to think about this. And so it's not, those numbers are staggering to think of the impact as, grossly north of $300 billion annually. That just, is kind of mind blowing. And at the same time, sobering. And at the same time, petrifying. So I would like to turn the conversation a little bit to, you remain, Dr. Trasande, an optimist. And I think that comes through in your work. But I wanted to talk about what are some of the reasons that give you hope, because I hear those linkages with endocrine disruption, and I have 3 children and I'm a little scared.
Well, let's take it in 2 pieces. There are safe and simple steps we can all take to reduce exposure. And there are changes we can make in our daily lives that make the business cases for companies to lead by example. So let's just talk for a minute about the safe and simple steps we can all take today. Because each of us are at home maybe right now and dealing with the pandemic and the circumstances and maybe at odds with what to do. So eating organic is a straightforward way to reduce your pesticide exposure. Study after study in low-income as well as high-income populations has shown you can reduce these exposures in days. This is not something that takes months. You can see a rapid change in your levels. And it doesn't have to be something that is just for the well-to-do. We know now that market share is accelerated with organic, such that organic food is being put side by side, even in the big box stores, with a smaller price margin than ever before. And the priority fruits and vegetables to eat organic are the leafy greens and vegetables, where you eat that outer layer. An avocado, maybe not so important. Avoiding microwaving plastic and machine dishwashing plastic is a straightforward way to avoid those chemicals leaching into food in the first place. And need to watch out for 3 recycling numbers. The numbers 3, 6, and 7 are the ones to avoid across the board. 3 are for the phthalates we talked about, 6 is for styrene, a known carcinogen, and 7 are for those bisphenols we talked about. And avoiding canned food is a straightforward way to reduce your exposure to bisphenols and other chemicals that are in the lining of these materials. One good thing about the pandemic is maybe we're not going as much to coffee shops and grabbing that thermal paper receipt. If you're out there doing it, maybe just ask for that electronic receipt and avoid the exposure altogether. And finally, since we're all indoors and there are a lot of electronics and furniture around, simply opening the window and recirculating that air is a way to get a lot of these persistent organic pollutants that accumulate out of our homes. And then one other thing for those PFAS, it's a good time to switch from non-stick cooking to cast iron or stainless steel. That's another way to avoid this family of PFAS that are out there to this day.
Thank you. And I will say, in a cheap promotion of Made Safe, we have a lot of lists of things that are made without any of these kinds of chemicals in it. So if people are wondering where to get started, that can be helpful, because I do hear from people all the time, okay, but where do I begin? And I love your list because it's actually very achievable. And I don't know if you talk to people about the expense of not doing this for their health. But one of the things that stays with me is that endocrine disruption may happen because of an exposure while a woman is pregnant, but it can impact as many as 3 or 4 generations down the line. So there's real reason to be motivated to do this, not just from what's important to you today, but based on what's so important for positive health outcomes for well-being of future generations, which when we think about sustainability is so important for us to think about. That's how we sustain life on this planet. There was another thing when I think about hope and positivity that I was hoping you could talk about in the book, which is you talk about something called genomics. And you actually cited a study. I just thought this for me was about future and a study with mice where the dose of the folate, sorry for if I'm butchering this, but the dose of the folate protected the mice against the impact from in the study, I believe it was bisphenol A.
Yes.
And I wondered, you said that study probably won't be ready to know or extrapolate to humans what that could be for another decade. But that seems like really interesting work. And I'd love for you to speak about that too, the preventative potential.
Sure. You actually described most of it beautifully, frankly. So essentially, they exposed a series of mice to different levels of bisphenol A, and they saw higher doses made the mice fatter. And then they added bisphenol A with folate, which is something we've added to cereal over the years. It protects against neural tube defects, and it has a host of beneficial consequences at the right levels. And what they found is that the folate reversed the obesity in the exposed mice, even if they were exposed to BPA. And they found that certain signals on genes, not the ACGT coding, were being changed. There were certain signals on the genes to turn them on and off that were being basically pushed back and forth in a way that spoke to the potential for reversibility. And we talk about a personalized medicine movement that is about these days. And the future personalized medicine isn't just going to be genomic testing in the future. It's going to be measuring these environmental contaminants and putting the data together in a way that healthcare providers can guide people about what exposures and what steps people can take to mitigate those exposures, even by adding certain dietary supplements to potentially manage and balance out some of the untoward effects they can't avoid in the first place.
I always think that is so important and exciting to hear that there is real science and study around some of that right now going on, so that we can be better prepared to deal with the world that we are inheriting and the world that we are passing on to our children. So thank you for sharing that. That makes me think folate was something most women are being told to take when they are conceiving or preparing to, and while they're pregnant. So that's interesting. But most of us are not pregnant for our whole lives and are concerned about our health. Some of us will never be pregnant. How can we, what are your sort of strategies on top of the additions for reducing our endocrine impact on ourselves? But in the face of trying to preserve our own health and living in this world, are there any last tips you would leave us with today?
You can do so much on your own. One consumer on his or her own has so much power with the wallet or pocketbook. And I think about the whole BPA-free movement. It wasn't science that changed that movement. There was plenty of science in 2008 when we got BPA out of baby bottles and sippy cups, don't get me wrong. But it was consumer and media attention, frankly, that drove the industry to run to the FDA and beg, please, please, please ban BPA from baby bottles and sippy cups. More recently, for these forever chemicals, it took a study of just 5 buffet-style food packages to get 2 major supermarket chains on Instagram and Facebook to push aside their old stock, get the manufacturers upstream to change their ways, and all of a sudden you saw these new products on the shelves. So that's an example where our purchasing power can go a long way. And let's remember, there are short, medium, and long-term benefits to preventing these exposures. You can see changes in these chemical levels in days. You might see changes in hormones in weeks. And then in the months that follow, you reduce your chronic disease regardless of whatever you were exposed to in the past. Yes, people get stuck on, well, I already messed myself up. That's possibly true for some things, but there's so much in this personalized medicine movement we're realizing we can correct by taking the safe and simple steps and looking forward, not backwards.
Right. So the power of epigenetics can save us potentially. And what we all have to use our voices for. And our voices in this case are our dollars. And our dollars cast a vote with everything that we are buying. And so you're going to hear a lot about voting today, probably, I expect. And in this session, we are talking about using your dollars to vote by what you purchase and really what you don't, and making that part of your method for change. So Dr. Trasande, thank you so much for the work that you do, for making the world better and safer and healthier for all of us, for trying to ensure that our children are not sicker, fatter, and poorer, and for motivating us to do better in our own lives, to be healthier, and to make that change by voting with our dollars. Thank you.
Thank you. This conversation gave me a lot of hope. So thank you.